Okay, think about this for a second. In the span of a single generation, the United States completely transformed itself from a nation of farms into a global industrial powerhouse. It was one of the fastest, most dramatic changes in history. So, what was the real engine that powered it all?
It is honestly hard to wrap your head around just how fast and how massive this change was. I mean, in 1880, America was overwhelmingly agricultural. Nearly half of the entire workforce were farmers. But fast forward just 40 years, and boom, the industrial workforce had exploded so much that it was now just as large as the farming workforce.
That kind of pace is just staggering. And it brings up the big question for us today. How on earth did a nation of farmers manage to become an industrial giant so incredibly quickly? What was the secret ingredient?
Well, to figure this out, most of us probably think back to what we learned in history class. The usual suspects. And look, those explanations are definitely part of the story, but they're not the whole story. Not by a long shot. You know the ones I'm talking about, right? The U.S. had tons of natural resources, like coal and iron, just sitting there. It was a hotbed for new tech and inventions. The railroad was spreading across the country, connecting everything and creating this giant national market. And of course, new ways of structuring companies, the modern corporation, allowed business to operate on a scale nobody had ever seen before.
But here's the thing. All of that stuff, the resources, the tech, the railroads, it all created the potential for a revolution. But it couldn't actually power it alone. I mean, coal doesn't just mine itself, right? Railroads don't lay their own track. All of it required one absolutely essential, indispensable ingredient: people. A massive, available workforce. And this, right here, is where the story gets really, really interesting. Because that indispensable workforce didn't just appear out of thin air. It came from a huge wave of immigration that, and this is no exaggeration, quite literally built the American Industrial Revolution from the ground up.
Just to fuel this boom, the manufacturing sector by itself needed 7.5 million new workers in those 40 years. Just stop and think about that number. Where do you find that many people who are willing to take on that kind of backbreaking work?
Well, by 1920, the impact on the population was just undeniable. More than a third of the entire country, 36%, belonged to what we can call the immigrant community. This wasn't some small minority. We're talking about a huge, transformative slice of the American population.
Now, when we say immigrant community, it's really important we're all on the same page. We're not just talking about the people who were born overseas. This includes both that first generation and the second generation. They're American-born kids whose lives and jobs were obviously shaped by their family's immigrant experience.
And the data shows exactly where this community was working. You see, they made up only about 23% of the farming workforce. But in manufacturing, they were the outright majority, at 53%. They weren't just participating in the new industrial economy, they were its very foundation. And if we zoom in on the absolute core industries of this revolution, the numbers get even more dramatic. The immigrant community made up 56% of steel workers, 58% in textiles, half of all coal miners, and in making clothes and apparel, an incredible 73%. In the industries that mattered most, they were the workforce.
So this, of course, leads to a pretty obvious question, right? If immigrants and their children were the ones powering the factories, where was everybody else? What were native-born Americans doing, and why weren't they filling these new industrial jobs?
Well, the hard truth is most native-born Americans simply did not want these jobs. And you can't really blame them. Factory work back then was incredibly hard, dangerous, and unpleasant. Even an official census report from 1920 flat out said it was more laborious, disagreeable, and lower-paying work. In fact, one study found that a quarter of all recent immigrant steelworkers were either injured or killed on the job.
And this preference led to two huge migrations happening at the same time, but going in opposite directions. While almost 14 million immigrants were pouring into the industrial cities of the Northeast and Midwest, about 2.5 million native-born white Americans were moving out of that same region. Many were heading west, looking for a different kind of life and opportunity.
So this whole dynamic had a huge, lasting legacy. The impact of this immigrant workforce went way beyond just filling tough jobs. It fundamentally reshaped the American economy, and believe it or not, it actually created new kinds of opportunities for everyone else.
Economists and historians have a name for this. They call it the labor queue or the push-up effect. And it's a pretty simple but powerful idea. It works like this. Step 1.
Immigrants arrive and take on those most demanding, low-skill jobs at the bottom. Step 2, their labor helps industry grow like crazy, which then creates a whole new demand for managers, clerks, engineers, and salespeople. And that leads to Step 3. Native-born workers get pushed up into these new, better-paying, higher-status jobs.
As historian Michael Haynes puts it, the immigrant workforce directly made possible the economic mobility of the native-born population. So they weren't just competing for the same jobs. You could say they formed a complementary labor force that actually expanded the whole economic pie, creating new rungs on the ladder for other people to climb.
Which brings us all the way back to a pretty fundamental question. When you look at the sheer number of workers needed, the dangerous and undesirable nature of the work, and the fact that many native-born Americans were heading west instead, you have to ask, could the American Industrial Revolution have even happened, at least at the speed and scale that it did, without this massive influx of immigrant labor? The evidence we've seen suggests it's pretty unlikely.
And so we're left with this final thought to chew on. The standard story of American industry is usually one of natural resources, amazing new technologies, and powerful corporations. But how does our understanding of that story change when we place an indispensable, immigrant-powered workforce right at the very center of how modern America was actually built?